Shalom, and welcome to the second program in the Ghetto Fighters House Talking Memory series, Rethinking the Final Solution and the Wannsee Conference 80 Years Later. The topic of today's program is the Belzec Death Camp, the Genesis of Genocide, with guest speakers Chris Webb, published author and historical researcher and an expert on the Operation Reinhard camps, and Tali Nates, founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. Tali will share with our audience today her family's Holocaust history, their life in Nowy Targ before the war, and the fate during the Nazi occupation. My name is Meidin Shachar, and I work at the Ghetto Fighters House as a guide and educator. I want to welcome our global audience, including friends and colleagues from Holocaust museums, institutions, and centers, Jewish heritage institutions, academics and students from universities, historians, and our many friends who attend our Talking Memory series. A special welcome to the survivors and their families that are with us today, especially those survivors and their families who lost loved ones in the Belzec extermination camp. The map of the Belzec Death Camp that was used in our promotional flyer and in this program's waiting room was created with one of only two survivors of the camp, Rudolf Riedel. And once again, we want to thank everyone for their support and interest in our programs. This series is in partnership with our friends at Liberation 75, Remember the Women Institute, Classrooms Without Borders, the House of the Wannsee Conference Memorial Site and Education Center, the Rabin Forum Chair at George Washington University, and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And now I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Tamir Hod, historian at the Ghetto Fighters House and producer of this series, to give the opening remarks for today's program. Tamir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Medin. Good evening, everyone. We continue with our series that offers rethinking about the final solution. This rethinking deals with the different approaches that have been headed to the field of research over the years. The previous program dealt with 90 minutes of bureaucratic evil took place in Wannsee. It was a fascinating lecture that was given by TSS. Tonight, we are holding the first of two programs that will deal with the Operation Reinhard death camps, Belzage, Sobibor and Treblinka. Belzage, which was the first of the three to operate the mechanism of the extermination, began operating on March 17, 1942. It was about 2 months after the Wannsee Conference had convened, but the green light was given on October 13, 1941, at a meeting in Lublin. Himmler instructed Tadeusz Globocnik, the SS and the police commandant in Lublin district, the task of setting up the Belzage camp and the camps that followed. It was a position Globocnik filled with the highest distinction. The three camps are defined as death camps, which means that everyone who sent to these camps, it was only for one purpose. Those that were kept alive, besides some exceptions, their job was to work in the extermination mechanism. What was the numbers of those who murdered in those death camps? One of the consequences of extermination of this magnitude is that we will never know the exact number. When I researched what happened at the Treblinka death camp, I found about 6 serious sources, each pointed to a different number of victims. Nevertheless, we can estimate that nearly a third of all Jewish victims of the Holocaust perished in Belzage, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The Belzage camp, which Chris and Tali will talk to you about today, was in fact the father camp of the two that followed. They were founded by learning from mistakes made in the first camp. One of the nicknames given to the Belzage extermination camp was the Forgotten Camp. Researchers who have viewed the various sources pertaining to the camp quickly discover their narrow scope. This is directly connected to the fact that there were almost no survivors at Belzage. One way to understand the lack of witness from Belzage is to comparison to Treblinka, for example, is the fact that in the Eichmann trial, no Jews were found to testify about Belzage, in contrast to 4 who were selected from the survivors of Treblinka. The June 7, 1961 issue of Haaretz, a local newspaper, contained an article bearing the headline, "Documents will testify about Belzage because no one survived." The text of the article itself explained that according to the report of the Polish Commission, only one person survived and his whereabouts were unknown. It was later discovered that Rudolf Freder was living in Toronto and had changed his name to Roman Robak. Rudolf Freder gave a testimony right after the war, and it was one of the most important evidence we got from the inside. I would like to quote a short part of Freder's testimony that shows us again how it was almost impossible for the victims to believe that they are about to be killed. And I quote, SS officer Fritz Ehrmann spoke in a loud and a very clear voice. You are now going to Beth. Then you will be sent to work. That's all. Everyone was pleased, happy that they were going to work and applauded. I remember the words he repeated every day, usually 3 times a day, during the 4 months I spent there. It was a moment of hope and illusion. For a moment, the people sounded relieved. There was completely serenity. The crowd walked forward in silence. I hope that you will find our program today meaningful to you all. Thank you, Medin.
Thank you, Tamir. And now it is my honor to present today's first guest speaker, Chris Webb. Chris has been interested in the Holocaust ever since the early 1970s, when his father gave him the book by Gerald Reitlinger, The Final Solution. 30 years later, following his first trip to Poland, where he visited the Belzec Death Camp, his interest and research really took off. In the intervening years, Chris Webb has built up a large collection of photographs and documents that covered Operation Reinhard. He co-founded the art group that went to Poland for a field trip in 2002, where they visited the 3 death camps that were part of the Operation Reinhard. When this group dissolved in 2005, Webb co-founded another Holocaust-related website group called HEART, Holocaust Education and Archive Research Team, and founded the Holocaust Historical Society with its own website. Since then, Webb has branched into further research and writing, publishing 6 books on Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, Kremno, and Auschwitz by Ebidim Press. The topic of Chris' presentation today is the title of today's program, The Belzec Death Camp, The Genesis of Genocide. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to start by welcoming everyone, and I hope you find this talk interesting. I've visited Belzage 3 times, in 2000, 2002, and 2004. So I have personal experience of the camp. And obviously what I'm going to talk to you tonight is the history of the camp, how it was founded, how it operated from day to day, right to the end of its life on May the 8th, 1943. And as Tamir said, it was the laboratory. It was the camp that developed the processes of mass murder, mainly by Christian Wirth, with trial and error. You will see from the slides that I'm going to show you how the camp developed and how it ended. Medina's already said this, so there's nothing more to add to that. Right, this is one of the few photographs taken in Belzage showing the main gate and the guard post and the Travniki men that guarded the camp. And it is an incredibly rare picture. Belzage really is an extremely small place. It's a small village, the back of beyond in southeastern Poland. And it first came to prominence with the establishment of forced labour camps. There are a number of camps, such as Kessler's Mill, the locomotive sheds, which would later form part of the Belzec Death Camp complex and a gypsy camp. The camps themselves were closed down in October 1940, and apart from the locomotive sheds, the death camp was built from scratch in an entirely different location. Quite a number of people say that it was built on the site of the former labour camps. No, it wasn't. Right, another famous picture. This is a picture of SS men behind the Kommandantur, which was Christian Wirth's office and living quarters. And I just wanted to point out that these two stone buildings were outside of the camp itself. They were opposite the station. And the man in front, third from the right, is Lawrence Hackenhalt. And Lawrence Hackenhalt was a very important figure for Belzage because he designed and operated the second gas chamber facility, and it then bore the name Stiftung Hackenhalt, which stands for Foundation Hackenhalt. Right, a slight change from what Tamir said. As far as I am aware, Globocnik met with Himmler and Kruger, who was the higher SS Police Führer Ost, in the Führer HQ at Rastenburg, where Globocnik was authorised on October the 13th to build a death camp at Belzage. Now, Action Reinhard, or the mass murder programme, which started in March with the mass deportation from Lublin, wasn't named Action Reinhard until after Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the security services, had been assassinated in Prague, and Globocnik named Action Reinhard in honour of Reinhard Heydrich, and that is important to know that. The next point I want to stress is a lot of historians write that Richard Tamala from the Central Building SS Building Administration in Zamość was responsible for building the camp. Well, we know from documented proof, mainly from the National Archives, of intercepted German telegrams that in fact Tamala was actually in the east working on the programme of SS strongpoints in the east, which Himmler ordered Globocnik to be in charge of. The main figure of Action Reinhard and the main figure of Belzage was its first commandant, Christian Wirth. Christian Wirth, who came from the police, actually worked for the T4 euthanasia program, and the T4 euthanasia program got their name from their address in Berlin, which was the T4 Tiergartenstraße 4, Berlin. So that was their headquarters, and that's why it's known as T4. Wirth played a leading role in the gassing of mentally disabled and ill people, and a great number of the personnel from T4 served in Belzage and the other two Action Reinhard camps. Here is a picture of Christian Wirth in Lublin. And the man on the left is a guy called Schwarzenbecker, and the man on the right is a man called Lastman. They're not connected with Belzage, or Schwarzenbecker was connected with Treblinka. Wirth arrived in Belzage just before Christmas 1941 and was appointed its first commandant. Oberhauser, who had built the camp, served as his deputy. Wirth arranged for a transfer of T4 Euthanasia Institute personnel from Bernburg to Belzage, including a number of people, one of which was a guy called Erich Fuchs. whilst the camp was being constructed, Wirth converted an old parcel van into a gas van that Fuchs drove. The gas van was not a success, and Wirth obviously needed to find a gassing facility that would kill hundreds of thousands of people. The gas vans were not the answer. The gassing facility that was developed used carbon monoxide gassing, and not many people know this, but local Polish tradesmen were used to build the gas chambers and barracks. Now that is unusual, because when Sobibor and Treblinka were built, they used Jewish forced labour to build them. They didn't repeat what they had done at Belzage. In terms of the staff, quite surprisingly, the number of people for the SS staff, approximately 30 in number, supplemented by another 120 Travniki men. The Travniki men were trained at Travniki, a SS training camp near Lublin. Some of the other members of the personnel that are worthy of mention are Reinhard Feix, Kurt Franz, who was later on to become Deputy Commandant of Treblinka, and then Commandant of Treblinka when Treblinka was actually wound up. Lawrence Hackenhalt, who you saw in the picture, who built the gas chamber. Fritz Yerman, who was a brutal sadist, and we'll mention more of him in relation to Raider later on, and Gottfried Schwartz. Of course, there are others, but they are the ones that actually are worthy of mention. Unlike Auschwitz and camps like that, Belzec Death Camp was really quite small. 3 sides, north, west and east, measured only 275 metres. The south side, 265 metres. It consisted of 2 camps, Camps 1 and Camps 2. Between Camp 1 and Camp 2 was the so-called tube, a barbed wire passageway that ran from the undressing barracks to the gas chambers. I'll talk more in a minute about the description and layout of the camp. What happened to Camp 1? Right. Oh, right. Sorry. Camp 2. Sorry. Right. Camp 2 contained 3 gas chambers, the mass graves, and 2 barracks for the worker Jews who serviced the extermination area. The living quarters for the SS were 2 pre-war stone houses on Tomaszewska Street near the railway station that were once owned by the Polish Railways. This building served as the commandantur and Wirth's living quarters. The other stone house was the living quarters of a number of other camp personnel. There was another building at the back called the Pavilion, which was a former Polish cottage that served as a general office. Next to it stood an armoury and a small stable. There were storehouses across the railway station, which was the old locomotive sheds, which was used as the camp storehouse, where victims' clothing was stored. This was emptied from time to time, and the victims' clothing was shipped to the old airfield camp at Lublin. There, it was disinfected disinfected, sorry, and shipped to the Reich and given to families in need. Okay. Why I included this photo, I wanted you to see that on the left of the photo is the external camp fencing, which you'll see is made of barbed wire and then surrounded by trees. This was so no one could see inside the camp as to what was going on there. Now we'll talk about the gas chambers. First of all, in the first phase, there were 3 gas chambers which measured 6 meters by 4. They were constructed with double wooden plank walls with the space in between filled with sand. They stood on a concrete foundation and were located in the eastern part of the camp. The capacity was 240 people in each chamber. On the northern side, 3 wooden doors opened outwards like garage doors, and that's where the victims, the corpses, were removed and taken to the burial graves, mass graves. The old gas chambers, in what was then known as phase 2, was replaced by a concrete building. And the concrete building containing 6 gas chambers, so they doubled the facility, and this was moved to a central location. As I've already said, this was named the Stiftung Hackenhalt after the person who designed it and operated it, Lawrence Hackenhalt. This was a low building with a flat roof, with wooden doors and a concrete ramp, and was built primarily so that it could cope with the increased capacity required to deal with transports from Krakow and Lvov. This is a fine drawing of the second phase gas chambers, drawn by my late friend Billy Rutherford. So, mass murder on a grand scale. In February 1942, trial gassings commenced, and then, as we've already learned from Tamir, the mass deportations from Lublin commenced on the 16th of March 1942. From mid-March to mid-April, some 26,000 Jews were deported from Lublin and gassed in those very primitive gas chambers. But it's important to note, and this is why we called the slide the genesis of genocide, is that during this time, Christian Wirth perfected the process of extermination, which was copied at the other 2 death camps. The 2 death camps had very similar layouts, but Wirth made sure that the process, right from when the transports arrived at Belzage to when the people were actually put into the mass graves, he carried out various processes to ensure that the most efficient manner was perfected. By this I mean they worked out that they did not want to hamper the swift transfer from people from the undressing rooms to the gas chambers. So they separated those that were disabled and ill, kept them to one side, and then killed them by shooting them at the edges of mass graves. In Sobibor and Treblinka, this was known as the Lazarette, which stands for military infirmary, and this was cleverly designed to make sure that the process was completed very speedily. At the end of March, transports from Lublin and Lvov district took place. And in June 1942, transports from Krakow and Lvov itself took place. On August the 1st, 1942, Christian Wirth left Belzage, where he was appointed to the post of Inspector of the SS Sonderkommando for the Abteilung Reinhard, e.g. the three camps Belzage, Sobibor and Treblinka. Gottlieb Hering was in fact an old comrade of Christian Wirth and was a member of the Stuttgart CID, as was Christian Wirth. In mid-August 1942, I can't read it, there was a famous visit to Belzage by Kurt Gerstein, who was the chief disinfection officer of the main hygienic office of the Waffen-SS. He was accompanied by a doctor, Dr. Wilhelm Pfannenstiel. And Kurt Gerstein, after the war, wrote a very detailed report on his visit to Belzage and Treblinka. And I would recommend everyone read that. The trip took place in mid-August, and afterwards, Gerstein said they went to Treblinka, where he witnessed a gassing there, and that the gas chambers themselves, there were 8 gas chambers. Well, at that time, in August 1942, there were only 3 gas chambers at Treblinka, which leads to the question that Pfannenstiel and Gerstein either went more than once to Belzage, but certainly went later than August 1942, probably more like September 1942. In December 1942, the last transports took place and the gassings ended. So when you think about it, Belzage was only operational from March 1942 to December 1942. And in that time, it is believed that something like 500,000 people lost their lives. That to me is a staggering fact and shows just how efficient, although primitive, Belzage was. This again is another rare picture showing Jewish capos by the sorting sheds inside the camp. And these photographs came from the regional museum at Tomaszów-Lubelski that has a photograph album which contains a number of pictures of Belzage. Now, photographs in the Action Reinhard camps was actually forbidden. And therefore, it's rare that we have pictures, but it seems that some of the German hierarchy, at least, didn't observe these things and actually took photographs within Belzage. Nothing incriminating, but nevertheless, that is rare. Okay. During my research for my book on Belzage, I found out that Rudolf Rader was actually named Rubin. And I found that from a 1939 Polish telephone directory, which listed his address. He was deported from Lvov to Belzage in August 1942. And he is the only survivor that produced an account of his life in published form in his memoirs after the war. Luckily, he escaped from Belzage after being sent to Lvov, or Lemberg as it was called then, by Fritz Yerman to pick up sheet metal for the camp. Another survivor, Chaim Hertzman, is worthy of mention. He escaped from the train taking the Belzage workers who had dismantled the camp to their death in the Sobibor Death Camp. But he was murdered by Polish anti-Semites in March 1946 after giving testimony, but did not publish any memoirs. From my research, the number of survivors of Belzage is low, possibly 10 at the most in terms of surviving the camp, but they didn't necessarily survive the war. So in terms of the final phase then, from December 1942, the focus shifted to exhuming the bodies and cremating the corpses. The bodies were burnt on pyres known as roasts, using railroad tracks on a concrete base. Now I will say this, from my stay in Belzage, I spoke to a woman who lived in Belzage during that time, and she said the smell was undescribable and everybody knew what was being done there. This work lasted until March and April 1943. Then the SS completely liquidated the camp. As I said earlier, the remaining Jewish workers were sent to Sobibor to be killed on arrival. The camp officially closed on May the 8th, 1943. Going back to the Jewish workers being sent to Sobibor, there are all sorts of claims by survivors of Sobibor and historians that this transport took place in either June or July 1943. Although one Jewish survivor does say it was May. My point is it seems unusual that if all the activity to dismantle the camp was completed by April, why would they then wait until June to ship out the workers? So I believe it was May. Now, this is one of the most important finds in recent years, has been in the National Archives in Kew, where British intelligence intercepted a telegram by Hermann Hoffler, who was the deputy head of Action Reinhard, and he sent a telegram to Krakow where it listed the number of people sent to the camps of Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and he included Majdanek as well in that. And this was in a report up until December the 31st, 1942, and we know now that gassing activity ended in December 1942. So this figure itself is incredibly important, as it shows that the number of people transported to Belzec was 434,508. Now, possibly, although it's not sure, whether this figure included Jews sent to Belzec from the Reich. So if we add another 20-odd thousand to that figure, you will end up with virtually 450,000 people being murdered at Belzec. And as I said earlier, between March 1942 and December 1942, I think that speaks for itself on just how murderous a place Belzec was. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us. There will be a Q&A session after other people speak, and I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
I wanted to say again, thank you, Chris, for your talk. And there are a lot of questions, and we will wait to the end until after Tali Nates gives her presentation as well. So I invite everyone to stay with us. So I am quickly going to introduce our next speaker. I have to say that for me, this is a very special event because as we were preparing this series, and of course, Tali Nates with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center was involved in creating this series, she offered to give this talk about her family, and we're so grateful for that. So I'd like to introduce a dear friend and colleague, Tali Nates. And like I just said, she is the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. She is an historian who lectures internationally on Holocaust education, genocide prevention, reconciliation, and human rights. Tali has presented at numerous international conferences, including at the United Nations in 2016 and in 2020. She published articles and contributed chapters to many books, among them God, Faith, and Identity from the Ashes, Reflections of Children and Grandchildren of Holocaust Survivors in 2015, Remembering the Holocaust in Educational Settings, 2018, and Conceptualizing Mass Violence, Representations, Recollections, and Reinterpretations in 2021. She won many awards, including the Kaya Community Service Award in South Africa in 2015, and the Ajit Gratius Award in the Czech Republic in 2020. Tali serves on the academic advisory group of the School of Social and Health Sciences in Monash University in South Africa, and she was one of the founders of the Holocaust and Tutsi Genocide Survivors Group in Johannesburg. Born to a family of Holocaust survivors, her father and uncle were saved by Oskar Schindler. The rest of the family was murdered, and we are here to hear that story this evening. From Nowy Targ to Belzec, a story of one family. Tali, my dear, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maydeen, and it is absolutely an honor to be with you. And Chris, thank you so much for giving us the information about Belzage. And so many people in the chat have family members, their descendants, they have testimonies about family members who were murdered in Belzage. So what I will try to do is to bring to you just one story, just one family representing the almost 500,000 men, women, and children who were murdered in Belzage in the 10 months that it was operational, from March to December of 1942. And I'll do it shortly, and I will try to give you a full story and connect it to what happened to the family in Belzage. So let me share my screen. I'm going to tell you the story of the Turner family. That is the family of my father, Moses, his brother, Henrik, his sisters, Hela and Sila, his parents, Zvi and Eleonora or Leah Turner. What I'm going to do is to use different sources. I'm going to use my uncle's memoir because he wrote and spoke about it while my father was silent. My father did not speak. I'm also going to use some documents that I got from researchers of the town of Nowy Targ. I'm going to share with you some unknown research and other information that I gathered. So let's go to the town of Nowy Targ, small town in the south of Poland, southwest of Poland, in an area called Galicia, Western Galicia. And the family lived there, arrived there in around 1918. And I want to share with you, from my uncle's words in his memoir, some memories of the family. And he writes, My parents, Eleonora and Zvi Turner, arrived in Nowy Targ in about 1918 and established a middle-range business. Father liked to study Torah in his free time, going to study with a group led by the local rabbi. I remember him as a wise man and a loyal friend. Mother had general education, tall, beautiful, full of energy, well known by all kind of people in the town. I especially remember her beautiful handwriting in Polish, in German, in Gothic German. She also liked to give charity, tzedakah, especially in secret. And our home was open to anyone who wanted or needed help. So these are some of his recollections from before the war. And sadly, though, his father, my grandfather, Zvi Turner, died of cancer when Henrik was 8 years old and my father was 4 years old only. And my uncle says, me and my brother Moses, that is my father, had to go every day to synagogue to say Kaddish. Our youngest sister, Stila, was born after the death of our father. Life was going on and we were spending time with our family and going to Zakopane for ski and taking part in schooling and youth movements. I was a member of the Beitar movement. My brother Moses, my father, was a member of Akiva. And my two sisters, Hela and Tila, were members of Bnei Akiva. And you see the diversity in that little family. We all went to Polish schools, but were traditional Jews and studied also Torah. Our uncle, mother's brother, was helping in the business and things were stabilizing at home. Now, I wanted to use my uncle's words just to describe normal life, life with tragedy, life with happiness, and places and places that you will see very, very soon that were fun places, places of ski in Zakopane that are becoming places of suffering very, very soon after. The war starts, 1st of September 1939. Nowy Targ is taken by the Nazis, and of course, persecution is starting very quickly. The town has few Jews, about 3,000 Jews, a little bit more than that. So my uncle describes it like that. Persecution and torture started very soon. We all had to wear a yellow star of David on our left sleeve with the word Jude marked clearly on it. Jews were ordered to do humiliating jobs, such as cleaning the streets or cleaning toilets. In Nowy Targ, the Jews stayed in their homes and there was no ghetto. There was a Judenrat in the town, and I'm going to share with you some amazing documents that I received a few years ago. Dr. Carolina Pence, who dedicated the last 12 years of her life researching the war years and also the post-war years in Nowy Targ. She lives in Nowy Targ, and she's a very brave, courageous historian that wrote tremendous articles and chapters in recent books. She sent me those documents that were records of the Judenrat in the town of Nowy Targ. On the left, you can see the document of Tila Turner, my little aunt, born in 1926. And on the right, the document of Hela Turner. I'm named, my second name is after Hela. My second name is actually Helen, after Hela, who was murdered in Belzage. She also sent me my grandmother, Leah's document from the town, and also my father's, Moses, on the right. Now, what you will find quite interesting is that the three women has a red cross on their documents. I'm just showing it again, sorry. But my father doesn't. My father was sent to a concentration camp while the three women were sent later to Belzage, where they were murdered. And my uncle reflects on that period. In 1941, they started to take men from the town and send them to concentration and labor camps, including the quarry in Zakopane. My brother Moses, again, that is my father, was one of these young men sent to Zakopane. Work there was extremely hard and dangerous, and the Nazi commandant, Weissmann, and guards were very sadistic. I was sent with another group to Rabka, to the SS school, to build the shooting range for target practice of the SS. The commandant there was Rosenbaum, who personally shot and killed many Jews. So my father is in Zakopane. He's about 14, 15 years old at that time. He works forced labor. My uncle is in Rabka at the SS school. And then he comes back to Nowy Targ. In August of 1942, the deportation from Nowy Targ begins. I took these pictures, actually my brother Amir took these pictures in one of our trips to Nowy Targ with the family in 2004. On the 28th of August, the Nazis announced for all the Jews of the town to gather in the football stadium that is opposite the train station, still today, still the same. In that day, everyone gathered in the football stadium and a selection took place. The majority of the Jews were taken to one side, while a smaller group, including my uncle, of men and women, able-bodied, young, were taken to the other side. A third group of the Judenrat, all their families and few others, were then marched to the Jewish cemetery, murdered there in a mass grave that exists until today. My uncle at this point did not understand that this is it, that this is a selection for life and death. Until his death at the age of 87, he mourned the fact that he never said goodbye, that he never hugged his mother, that he never said to his sisters that he loved them. And he always had that terrible guilt of that moment of not understanding that this is actually the end. The majority of the Jews, including my family, then were taken across the road to the train station and then to Belzage. According to Yitzhak Arad, his book that is listing all the transports, the Jews of Nowy Targ arrived in Belzage on the 30th of August and were murdered then. No one, of course, survived. What happened to my uncle? What happened to my father? My uncle Henrik was taken from Nowy Targ to a slave labor camp in Czarny Dunajec, cutting wood and so on, but then after that to Plaszów, concentration camp in Krakow. About a year later, my father was sent from Zakopane, where he was in the quarry, in the forced labor camp, also to Plaszów. So in the end of 1943, they reunited. I do not have time to tell you the full story of their experiences, but I can only tell you that, of course, they worked very hard labor there. And in 1944, both my uncle and my father were chosen to a terrible task. They were part of Sonderkommando 1005 that had to open the mass graves of the Jews that were murdered in Krakow and in Plaszów, Krakow Ghetto and in Plaszów, and remove the bodies and burn the bodies. And I can tell you that my father had nightmares about it until the day he died. Of course, the story continues with Oskar Schindler that, again, I have no time to tell the full story, but of course he had his factory in Krakow, the Emilia factory with about 400 Jewish workers and Polish workers, increased to about 600 workers, but then moved to Plaszów, created the list of 1,000 men, women, and children created the camp in Brunlitz in the Sudetenland next to Svitau, his hometown. And my father and my uncle were part of that list. I marked on page 10 of the list, this is the list of the prisoners, the men prisoners that were sent first to Grossrosen, and then from Grossrosen to Brunlitz. The women were, of course, sent to Auschwitz, and from Auschwitz to Brunlitz. I marked the names of Turner Moses and Turner Henrik. And these are the pictures of my father and uncle immediately after liberation. They were then liberated in Brunlitz by the Soviet army in May of 1945. My uncle and my father always mourn the fact that they don't have a picture of their father, of their mother, of their families, of themselves as children. They just had nothing. But somehow they found images of their sisters, actually drawings of their sisters. And those are the only pictures that we have of the family until now. So to recap, Eleonora, Hella and Sila Turner were murdered at the Belzage killing center or death camp. Henrik Turner survived 5 different concentration camps. Moses Turner, my father, survived 4 different concentration camps. I visited Belzage for the first time, and Chris, the same as you, in the year 2000. Chris, you must agree with me that it was a shocking place, broken, dirty, with fleas and bottles of whiskey spread all around. I was also invited with my family in 2004, the 3rd of June 2004, to the opening of the Belzage Memorial and Museum. I visited there a few times after that. But that opening was very, very meaningful. There were people from the town, from the village of Belzage. There were priests, there were nuns, there was the chief rabbi of Poland. There were survivors that lost families in the death camp. And there were many, many others. And I will never forget the dedication speech by Miles Lerman, a survivor from Tomaszów Lubelski, that also lost his family there at the camp. For those that are interested, I do not have time to go into the details, but those that are interested, on the 24th of February, together with Classroom Without Borders and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and many other partners, we will have a talk with myself, Michael Berenbaum, Professor Michael Berenbaum, and Rabbi Andrew Baker. All of them were there in 2004 in the opening and involved in the creation of the museum and memorial at Belzage. And I'll be very happy if you can join us. This is me, much younger, with different color hair. And of course, marking the place where my family came from, Nowy Targ, and trying to find in the wall of names, first names of all the victims, the 500,000 victims or so, trying to find the names of my family and light a candle in their honor. My uncle wrote a lot, spoke a lot. As I said, my father was the silent one. And in the year 2000, just a few years before his death, at the age of 80, he wrote this poem in Haifa. And let me read this poem to you. He called it HaShoah. I write this poem for generations to come, with tears in my eyes when I remember the faces of my dear ones. When they stood on the Appelplatz, the barbarians robbed and beat them. Children were torn from their mothers. They cried, screamed, Shema Israel, but up above, no one heard them. Close to each other they stood, to part they could not, to hug each other with a hearty kiss. The evening got nearer and nearer, but the barbarians shoved and pushed to the transporters, to the labor camps, and to the cattle trucks that moved to the death camps. They cried, screamed, Shema Israel, but up above, no one heard them. We survived the war. We survived the destruction, thanks to the savior, Oskar Schindler, his list. We returned to Poland, disappointed and broken, not finding our dear Jewish families anywhere, visiting the graves of the holy and pure ones that died on Kiddush Hashem. They cried, screamed, Shema Israel, but up above, no one heard them. My uncle was an activist. In 1965, he returned to Germany. He gave testimony in the Freiburg trial against two of the Nazi war criminals. You heard their names before. Arno Semisch and Philipp Weissmann received only 4.5 years sentence and 7 years sentence for all those crimes that you see on your screen, including the mass shootings of Jewish men, women, and children in Nowy Targ, the mass shooting in the Jewish cemetery, and many, many other cases of shootings. But my uncle felt that he had to do it. He just had to do it. The story of my family does not end there. Just last November, 2021, the local community of Nowy Targ, led by Polish Olympic kayak champion Dariusz Popila and his civil society organization, People Not Numbers, and Dr. Carolina Pence, that I mentioned before, researched and established a memorial in the Jewish cemetery of Nowy Targ with 2,866 names of all those Jews murdered in Belzage or in the town or in other camps. Also, the gravestone of my grandfather, Zvi Turner, that disappeared, that we never found in the Jewish cemetery, that was desolated and desecrated. As I told you, he passed away before the war, and Dariusz Popila notified me in May 2021 that he found it. He found it next to a small airport in Nowy Targ, in a farm. He restored it, and it is now placed back in the cemetery. So this is an amazingly inspiring story for me, and hopefully for you too, about how an individual in a community can make a difference on the ground today and can still remember in a very meaningful way those nameless 2,866 people, giving them back their names. To end the story, I founded, as Medine said, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And my father's and my family's story played a huge role in founding this center. It is their legacy, that of my family who were murdered in Belzage, but also my family who survived. Thank you very much.
Tali, thank you very much for your emotional words. And I must tell to the audience that Tali and I speak a lot with each other. It's the first time I heard this story, and I want to thank you in person for that. I also would like to recognize the people in our audience whose families were killed in Belzage. And I want to thank our audience for mentioning the names of their relatives. I think it's a big part of what we are doing here. It's to remember. And I also want to tell both of you that while looking at the chat box, so many people thank you for that, for for what you're doing here, about telling about Belzage and what happened there. Also, Tali, someone here asking if there is a book, or even for children, that they can read about this private story of yours.
So there is the family memoir that my uncle, of course, wrote, in many poems. He wasn't a poet; he was actually an engineer. But but maybe it's an idea. It's something for me to actually work on and actually publish. So thank you very much for the idea.
And I said the poem was from 2000, so
yeah,
you didn't write till then. It was like...
no.
Okay.
In his old age, he started to write poems because he, after the Holocaust, he was part of the Bricha, and then he was interned in Cyprus, and so he had a lot of stories. So he wrote poems about each one of the chapters of his life. Quite an interesting.
We also know the phenomena here in Israel. I don't know what's going on now outside, but in Israel, that sometimes it takes like 30 or 40 years until people like really talked about or write about what they're going through from different reasons. Thank you very much, Tali, for that. I have also a few questions for Chris. Chris, you're with us? Chris.
Hello.
Hi, Chris. So Kathy Adorian is asking about the photo you show in your the beginning of the lecture about the SS team in Belzage,
Right.
and she's asking how many of those Nazis in the picture, or maybe in general from Belzage, were caught and was put on trial. I remember the trial was between 63 to 65, but there were only 7 or 8, right? That were put on trial from Belzage.
Yeah, correct. Actually, there was that was a pre-trial. There was actually only one person actually went to trial, and that was Joseph Oberhauser. All the others, of which there weren't many, said that they were pressurized by Christian Wirt to serve in Belzage under duress, and the judges believed that story and decided not to prosecute them. And therefore, the only person that was held to account for Belzage was Joseph Oberhauser. And he received a very minor sentence, I can't remember exactly now, but 3 or 4 years. That was it.
I must adhere.
One of the people in the picture, Tauscher, he was arrested but committed suicide before the trial could commence, or the pre-trial could commence. A couple of the other people in the picture were actually prosecuted in Hagen for the Sobibor trial. They served at Sobibor. There was a few of them, Werner Dubois, Ernst Zirk, and a few others, Robert Yers, but not many. Not many were brought to account.
Can you tell us about the trial? I mean, do we have some of the details about Belzage coming from those trials?
Yes, but not much, and it's mainly in German. So, but not much. The trial itself only lasted a couple of days.
Debbie Enshirer asking if we continue about details from the camp. Is there a list of the names of the Jews that were murdered in Belzage?
No. Generally speaking, and I think this is worth explaining, is that with the exception of transports from Germany, of which there are records, and transports from Theresienstadt, of which there are records, and transports from Westerbork to Sobibor, they are the only records. The Germans didn't bother to compile lists of people from Polish ghettos, bearing in mind, within a very short space of time, they were going to be killed. I mean, tragic story itself, because you can't trace these people, but that's why there are no transport lists for Polish Jews, or very few. The Judenrat might have produced a list for certain transports. Generally speaking, there are no lists for Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzage, apart from where I've just mentioned. So you will learn that people have been transported there, generally from either survivors or from researchers and books that mention their names.
I just see one. Thank you, Chris. I just see one question here. Where were the SS judges in what country? It was in Germany.
In West Germany,
said,
yes.
Yeah, in the mid of the 60s.
Mid-60s, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And another question. Aggie Lucas asking, were the Roma treated differently than the others, than the Jews? I guess that's the question. And she's also asking a personal question. I mean, what was your place in choosing to write about Belzage?
Well, I've written about all the Operation Reinhard camps, and my interest, I am not Jewish, by the way, I'm English. I have no Jewish connection. I have no attachment per se. My father bought me a book called The Final Solution. I've always been fascinated with history. I've always loved history, and that subject just grabbed me, and that's why I've researched it virtually all my adult life. Okay.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Medin, we have more questions?
There are so many questions. I don't know what we're supposed to do with the time that we have left. I think what I will do, though, is Chris and Tali, I will send you the copy of the chat, and you can definitely look over them. I think there are about 30, 40 questions here, at least. Some of them are very personal about specific families, and others are more general about the more historical side. And I think that we'll save that for you to look over and get in touch with people.
Yeah, I just want to say to Chris and Tali that in my opening words, I said that Belzec got a nickname like the Forgotten Camp, and I can say now that you help us to see Belzec as less forgettable. So thank you for that.
Can I just say that within my books, I have created a Jewish roll of remembrance that lists the names of those that were sadly killed, those that escaped from the camp, and then also an extracted list, if you like, because you can't name hundreds of thousands of people in a book, where I have some biographical details. I include their names in the list. So, you know, people can buy the book. I mean, it's not a plug for the book. People can see in the books their names of their relatives that died at these 3 camps.
Thank you so much for that as well. Tamir, I think we're gonna close. So once again, I want to say thank you to Chris Webb and to Tali Nates for enlightening us and not only putting a place back together for us, but a family as well, to make it more personal. And I wrote to Tali quickly in WhatsApp how affected I was by both of these talks. And I think our audience is saying the same thing as well in the chat. And again, I want to thank our audience, our global audience, for coming to be with us today. I apologize, I was a little off, little tippy today. I'm home in quarantine with COVID, but it was very important for me to be here with everyone. And didn't thank again Tamir, I call him my partner in crime. Maybe it's not a very good association, but he really is the creator of this incredible program. And thank you so much for being with me here today as well and taking over everything. So once again, shalom, everyone. I hope everyone is healthy and staying healthy and keeping safe. And we will see you again on the 27th. And shalom, Chris, and shalom, Tali, and Tamir, and we'll see you soon.